Thank you. Thanks for being here. Nice to see you all. And congratulations to James and the team for the innovation around Innovation Zero. I think it's the first year. So congratulations to them. And in essence, they're bringing that sort of concept to reality is part of what we're going to discuss today. So from the core principles of from ambition to action. So a lot is talked about in, you could say, rating agencies, within companies, within the hard to abate sectors around decarbonisation and net zero. And there has been plenty of pledges and commitments. And today's to give you an update on what we've been doing, what the work of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, BP and other task force in creating a framework to channel capital into accelerating transitioning companies in line with the Paris Agreement. So generally very excited and delighted to have Antoine and Alan with us. Just a little bit of background. I guess a lot of people have heard of Fitch, probably for the production and credit rating, financial credit ratings. We rate companies, countries, debt from a sort of financial materiality perspective with a relative probability of default on entities and bonds and instruments. And then in the back end of 2021, so about 18 months ago, Sustainable Fitch was launched with a view of producing, I guess, ESG assessments, ratings, products to look at the impact and outcomes that companies will have on the environment and or society. And in part of that is our soon-to-be brand new product, which will be a transition assessment for the energy generating sectors. I've been at Fitch for about 14, 15 years, so from the financial crisis to today. Lots of interesting times within that, and now my role is more in ESG and sustainability. So without further ado, I'll ask Alan and Antoine to say a few words, your remit, your time, and yeah, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Craig, and thank you everybody for joining today. I've had the pleasure of working with the Sustainable Markets Initiative. Within BP, I lead our environment, social and governance activity. And one of the things which we feel very strongly is that we need action. And you talked, Craig, about turning ambition into action. We recognise that the world faces a very, very substantial challenge. We recognise that we need to transform the energy system, and that transformation needs to happen quickly, but equally it needs to happen in an orderly and balanced fashion. And what we would therefore say is that people who are part of the energy system, and we've seen how fragile that energy system is under the circumstances of the invasion of Ukraine, people who are in that energy system need to transition, want to transition, and need support in order to transition. And the real question when it comes to how do you support a company in transition is, how do you know that one is in transition? How do you identify them? And that's really where the assessment product, which Craig was talking about, comes in. Now, we need to be able to evaluate what people are saying, but also what they're doing. And so the logic of what the work we did within the Sustainable Markets Initiative, and just let me give a bit of background on Sustainable Markets Initiative. It's a coalition of the willing looking to bring the private sector into play in order to accelerate a transition to a more sustainable future. It's hosted by, founded by the then Prince of Wales, the now King, has some 500 CEOs as members with a number of task force looking to identify opportunities to create that sustainable future. One of the task forces is the energy transition, led by my CEO, Bernard Looney. And within that task force are some work streams. And one which I had the privilege of leading for the last 18 months was about how we bring in clarity to the energy transition. And what we were looking to do was to provide differentiation between, well, a company which is already fully sustainable in the environmental emissions sense, so it's green, let's call them, and a company which is energy intensive, but perhaps making no commitment to transition. But between those two bookends are very many, perhaps the majority of the energy sector, often making commitments to transition, but we want to sort of be able to differentiate within that spectrum where people stand, where they're trying to get to, where they are, and therefore encourage people to move further and faster. Now, what we're looking to do going forward is, having created a frame, and I'll talk about the nature of that frame in just a moment, but it's one thing to create a frame, but we want it to be useful to decision makers, and therefore it's a frame which we want to have people assessed. And in order to be assessed, I think it's very important that somebody with independence, with experience of an assessment process, takes it on. And as the SMI task force, we were absolutely delighted when Sustainable Fitch said that they wanted to take on the framework and operationalize it. So what is the framework? Well, as I say, in order to identify where somebody stands in a transition, we're looking for what is their ambition. And fundamentally, we're looking for people to commit to reducing their emissions to net zero by 2050 or sooner. But we're also looking for evidence of that ambition being executed. And therefore, the framework says there are multiple ways to get to net zero for people, particularly in the oil and gas sector, for people who are intensive users of oil and gas, but this covers fossil fuels in general. There are really a couple of routes to get to net zero. One is to decarbonize oil and gas, and the other one is to displace the oil and gas with lower carbon solutions and ultimately zero carbon solutions. And we call that greening. It's a sort of a transition as people morph from one place to another. So recognizing that there are a couple of routes, and again, the frame is designed to say which of those paths is somebody on, we're saying, well, how far advanced are they on their path? What is their ambition? What is their progress to date? What is the momentum of that progress? Are they putting their money where their mouth is? So can you see evidence of investment going into either decarbonisation and or into the creation of alternatives? Because what we're looking ultimately to do is to see people reducing their emissions, removing their emissions, or replacing their emissions or the source of their emissions with an alternative. And the framework is designed to identify people in that case. So we want to have something which is objective, says where are people on the journey, and comes up with some kind of a classification. Now, recognizing that it's quite hard to be super quantifiable in this, we proposed a sort of a color scheme where we sort of have, black at one end of the frame, moving to brown, to olive, to light green, and then to green, so that you can see the nature of people's progress. The one thing I should say in all of this is companies in transition are not, or at least I would say we are not, claiming to be green at this stage, which is why I say we use the word greening. It is a transition because one of the key things, in my opinion, is in order to transform the energy system, it can't happen overnight. There are people who wish it could, but I think the Ukraine crisis has proven the difficulty of a dislocation, shown how fragile the energy system is. So we need a transition, but we need to show that we're making progress in that transition and therefore identifying where people stand in the transition. It's that framework which the SMI group created and that framework which we passed over to Sustainable Fitch for them to create an assessment product to tell us all collectively where people stand in the transition. At that point, let me pass back to you, Craig.
Thanks, Alan. So yeah, all about building trust and transparency whilst transitioning, I suppose, and that's the 3 T's, which I think underpin the work Fitch do and the work that the SMI have done. Just breaking it down a little bit more in terms of when you and the Energy Transition Task Force, so another alphabet soup, the ETTF, got involved and started discussing and debating with the other members, I think including Equinor and Chevron and other groups. Can you just give the audience a sort of a feel for those sort of discussions and how that might have been shaped in terms of the frame that was created, as well as some of the differences or similarities in sort of upstream, downstream, different regions, etc.?
I think one of the questions people always ask is there one single pathway to net zero? Are there multiple options for how one gets there? And should one be agnostic, particularly agnostic to both the path and the technologies involved? So in other words, there are people who may intend to stay with oil and gas, but intend to decarbonize it, and decarbonize it through efficiency, through electrification of some of their processes, through carbon capture, use and storage. So ways to sort of decarbonize. And again, people wanted to say, if we can show evidence of progress, that is a legitimate way to get to net zero. Now, equally, there are other companies who are looking at different strategies. And so we're not trying to assess people's strategy. We're trying to assess people's progress in delivering that strategy towards net zero. So you have another group of person who is looking to build out alternatives to fossil fuels, maybe in combination, maybe as a replacement for those fossil fuels. So we wanted a framework which was all-encompassing, because we wanted to sort of recognize that variety of pathways to net zero. And we wanted to sort of enable people to gain credit, if credit was due, for the path which they were on. Now, inevitably, you get differences of opinion as to how you measure progress. So one illustration would be, quite a lot of times people will say, well, what are your revenues? Are your revenues now coming from a traditional source of energy or from a lower carbon source? And revenue is quite a tricky topic, because partly there's a lag effect between people investing and the revenues coming out. Partly, revenues can represent a situation, but they can also sort of sometimes disguise it, which is why we sort of landed on how much investment are you putting in. We thought that was a good indicator of whether people were walking the talk, basically. So within the group, quite a bit of debate as to how could you have something which got everybody in transition onto the playing field. And we weren't the people saying this is the right way, this is the best way. We just wanted to say people in transition should be able to put their case. The framework should recognize that we need everybody. And I think that's a very important theme in this work. We believe that the energy transformation needs us all. Generally, you mentioned some of the company names. I think the producers are sort of finding the framework sort of more something which they recognize. But what we also want to do is make sure that the energy intensive consumers are thinking in the same line, and that the energy intensive consumers are also decarbonizing or also looking at alternatives.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan. Before we move on to one-to-one in a few minutes, can you just expand a little bit on the frame, in the sense of the emissions ambition, emissions reduction, and financial investments, and then the sort of theory or thought around scope 1, 2, 3, and that sort of balance between short-term, long-term, and how those key indicators of performance got framed?
I think generally people will have an expectation that a company in transition, not only has an ambition, 2050 is often the date which people are using, but we recognize that that is a long way away. So people want to know, what is the rate of progress? What are the actions being taken? That's one of the key things in all of this. When are what actions going to occur? And that's why I say, investment into those actions is a key metric. Now again, in a framework, we don't necessarily want to be prescriptive about who can get onto the playing field. We want a framework which can represent everybody, but clearly that framework will show the differentiation. And again, I come back to the point we were trying to make, which was we were trying to say, between those who have no plans to abate and those who are already at net zero, there's a wide range of strategies, there's a wide range of company. So the logic of the framework was to say, he who has sort of the greatest ambition, or the greater transparency, or the greater coverage, or the sort of the more interim steps, will get sort of recognition for that. And so we weren't being prescriptive, but we were saying, and it was one of the questions which was being asked, for instance, is scope 3 something which should be featured? And again, the simple answer is, somebody who has a scope 3 target is going to be held with more regard, look better on the framework than somebody who doesn't. But we absolutely wanted people to have ambitions, particularly for scopes 1 and 2. But I think, ultimately net zero covers the full range. And to your point about timeframes, there need to be short and medium term steps to indicate that people are in action. And again, if we think about the sort of title of the session, From Ambition to Action, it really is about proving that the actions are occurring. Because I come back to what I said right at the beginning, we need to take action now. We need to encourage people to take action now. And we need to recognise and support people who are taking action now.
Excellent, thank you. We will have about 5 minutes for questions at the end, so start thinking about them. So emissions focus, transition assessment, and then in COP, it was announced that Sustainable Fitch was going to be the provider of the transition assessment. So over the last 6 months, Antoine and team have been working on, I suppose, taking that frame and the theory into practice in terms of a defined methodology with those usual rating agency metrics and methodology and assessment to independently rate companies in the energy space with this transition framework. So Antoine, maybe introduce yourself before we kick off with a little bit of Q&A.
Sure. Hello. I work within the ESG rating team, so looking after the corporate sectors in EMEA, and what we do is primarily, so initially we were launched in 2021 looking at ESG ratings, so assessing the performance from an impact point of view of companies. And we launched the product officially in 2022, and in parallel we developed other products, as Craig mentioned, and one of which is the one we're talking about today, SMI, and the transition assessment. So I'm looking at that as well with some colleagues in the energy team in London. And in terms of what we've been doing in the past 6 months, I think it's fair to say we've been very busy working on it. With the aim of really, as Alan said, operationalizing it. So moving from, an idea, a framework to making it work. And maybe if I just stop on the aspect of transition, an interesting thing that we've seen recently is a lot of transition assessment going out. And one of the reasons, that's my view, maybe don't quote me on this, but you have a lot of means for investor, asset owners, and company to identify what is green nowadays. You have taxonomies, and you have very specific technologies that allow people to say, well, my portfolio is more or less green. But that created a gap in the market, which is, well, I've got a bunch of other investment that, are not green now, but what can I do with it if I know that, they are still helping the society in moving towards 1.5, well below 2 degree scenario, making sure that I can distinguish the company that are doing the right thing. And that's where transition assessment is really emphasizing, looking at companies that are not yet green, but yet they are aiming at moving and delivering that transition. So that's really for the context, and I guess the idea for us was to say we don't want to come up with our own assessment because there's a lot out there already, but we want to build on work that's already been done with industry peers, and SMI came along, so that's a very exciting participation and collaboration that we are undertaking at the moment. And in terms of what we've been doing in the past 6 months, we've been engaging with companies. So we have 10 significant companies within the oil and gas sector. We're exchanging with them. We're making sure that we can look at the threshold, we can calibrate it, because initially the idea is to be able to distinguish companies. So we don't want all of them to be green or to be black. We want them to be somewhere, reflecting their advancement in the transition. So we've been working on that and, determining threshold, and determining what means being ambitious in a transition, but also realistic. We can't expect companies to deliver a certain amount of reduction, in a very short amount of time. So we had to really build and operationalize it in the past 6 months, Craig.
Thanks very much. And before I forget, the Sustainable Markets Initiative and the white paper that was published at COP in November 2022 is a fantastic read. So I think it's about sort of 15, 16 pages and really does give a very detailed overview of the work done by the various groups. So I'd encourage you to read that. So Antoine, specifically on the sort of colours, I guess credit rating agencies use letters. Some ESG rating agencies use numbers. So what is the what is the magic sauce within transition assessment?
So for transition, we kept the initial color code that was part of transition assessment, and the idea is to say it's probably more visual. You know, you understand the company's transitioning, so what is the type of color it sits in. So we thought it was, it was a good indicator. And at the moment you've got, so Alan mentioned it, you had 6 potential outcome from black to green, and in the middle you've got brown, light brown, olive, and light green. And whilst this is useful, we thought, okay, that's probably quite limiting, because if you think about it, black companies rated as black are companies that aren't doing anything in the transition space. They don't have any ambition, they don't have any reduction in emission. And then you have green companies that are already fully transitioned, sort of net zero compliant. So it leaves you with 4 potential outcomes. So we thought it would be good to have a bit more granularity. So we introduced the notion of qualifiers, whereby you would effectively have each color code being broken down into 3 different outcomes. So you would have minus, equal, and plus. So it means, you have now 12 outcomes where companies are going to be assessed within the transition assessment. And that will also come with a 2-pager where we'll have some context and, an analysis from the team to mention what the company is doing, where is it meaningful, where is it potentially lacking. So that's really the scale at the moment.
Thanks, Antoine. And then, as you've been developing it and speaking to and engaging with the companies, what have sort of been the biggest sort of challenges in sort of defining where that methodology sits, and what has been your sort of the challenges on that side?
Yeah, so okay. So I think first of all, the challenges would happen in any sector. So I think it's not something specific to the oil and gas sector. It's always about comparability, transparency, and what are you talking about when you say we have a net zero ambition, or we are planning to transition? These are big words, but then you need to really start digging into it and try to understand what is the company doing. So what we found interesting within the oil and gas space is, you would have companies using the same terms, but having very different targets and meanings. So, for instance, if you look at a company that has a scope 1 and 2, let's say absolute, net zero ambition by 2050, you might realize that company is actually only having that ambition for a restricted perimeter of the company. So you could have a company saying, our upstream scope 1 and 2 net zero, and and that's the ambition, and they leave outside some other meaningful business. They might have chemical activities, they might have downstream activities, and that might not be encompassed. So that is something that people need to have in mind when they assess a net zero ambition. Other things that are relevant is what type of gases do you include, because carbon is obviously very important, but methane is equally very important. It's responsible for 25% of the current global warming that is happening, so it's something that shouldn't be left out. So you want to make sure the company include all the different carbon. And another element is some companies use the word carbon neutral, some companies use the word net zero. What does it mean? What's the difference? And generally speaking, carbon neutrality means you're able to rely on offsets for potentially a significant amount of your emission, whereas net zero is really telling you, I'm going to first reduce my emission, ideally up to 90%, and the rest will be offset. So these are challenges that we had to build in the model to be able to account for what we call partial coverage. So when you have ambition that are only partially addressing the business. And another very interesting topic within oil and gas is the GHG accounting. So I don't want to get too technical, but the way emissions are being accounted can be one of the 2 methods mainly. It's equity accounting, so equity stake, where a company would say, I've got 10 operating assets, and I've got X% of share in all of these assets, so I'm going to account for the emission on a pro rata basis, okay? And you have another method, which is the operational control, where companies say, I've got 10 operating assets. I mean, I'm invested in 10 operating assets, but I only control 3 of them. So I'm only going to account for the emission where I've got the operational control, because these are where I can actually influence the emission. So I'm going to account for 100% of the emission where I've got operational control, but I'm not going to account for the one where I've got an equity stake. And so you can imagine that some of those methods can yield very different results. So ideally, you want to see the 2 accounting standard being used so that it's then contextualized within the transition, and you can give the best assessment and the most transparent assessment to the stakeholders.
Thanks, Antoine. Just open it up for questions at this stage. I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so if there is any burning questions in the room, you can, I think there's a microphone around, but if you want to put your hand up.
And I think while we wait for those, Craig, I mean, one of the things I would say is it's very clear listening to Antoine, and I feel it myself, this is immensely complex. What we were trying to do in the frame, and what I think your assessment product will do, is take something very complex and create an outcome which is simple, not simplistic, easy to understand so that people can use it for their purposes. You talked about comparability, some degree of clarity. I mean, what again the framework doesn't do is say, it doesn't set a benchmark, it doesn't set a hurdle and say, this is an outcome which is wanted. It allows people, the decision makers, investors, customers, stakeholders, to make that decision for themselves by presenting it in a very transparent way.
Yeah, no, definitely. The number of investors, asset managers, asset owners who are wanting tools and data sort of served up to them in a sort of independent way that gives them a view as to the efforts that are going into this are loud and clear, as well as the banks themselves that are looking for transition tools. So the product will be hopefully launched, fingers crossed, in the next few weeks, certainly before summer. So please do keep an eye out for it. Visit sustainablefitch.com. Oh, have we got a question?
Yeah.
Do you want to just introduce yourself and then?
Try again.
Hi, I'm Christoph. I work for the University of Oxford on sustainable finance. Thank you very much to the panel for a very interesting discussion and introduction to the new transition ratings that you're talking about. I have two questions. One is on the data sources that you use to assess the transition and the progress. And the second is, how do you weigh ongoing investments in, let's say, brown assets or technologies versus the growing ongoing investments in the green technologies and assets? Thank you.
I can take it. Yeah. In terms of the sources, so we are interacting with the companies. So we are directly, exchanging with them to make sure we understand the data, we contextualize them, and we're able to really go beyond, what you might read in an annual report. So in the case of collecting data, it would be in the case of the transition assessment for oil and gas, it would be the oil and gas companies giving us the data. And then we would be, analyzing them and exchanging. If we have doubt, we would be asking for confirmation and, a bit more context around it. Now, when it comes to the second question about decarbonizing and green, that's a very pertinent question. It's actually, so Alan mentioned it, but so decarbonizing, we talk about electrification, we talk about, methane leakages detection, anything that allows an existing asset of an oil and gas company to continue operating, but just more energy efficiently. And then you've got the green investment, which are investment that replace an old technology, is already sort of sustainable. And in the model, the way we've assessed that, if we have one of the line item in the assessment that looks at how much green versus decarbonizing as a ratio, acknowledging the fact that the more green you do, the more impact you have. So what we're saying is we don't want to discourage decarbonizing because that's still going to help companies transitioning. But the more green you do, the more that will benefit a specific line item in a model, because that's effectively shifting your business model from having assets that generate emissions to having more and more assets that are a lot more efficient or generate zero emission for some of them.
Any more questions from the room? If not, any closing remarks from Alan, Antoine?
Closing remarks. Well, I mean, it's great to be here, and hope you managed to hear us despite the noise. It's not always easy, but we're going to release the product hopefully in the coming weeks. So if you have any question, we're more than happy to help. And looking forward to really making it work and extending potentially to other sectors as well, because as I said, oil and gas is one of the carbon intensive sector, but it's not the only one. So there might be room for using similar approach to other sectors. So yeah, we're going to focus on delivering it in the first place, and then rolling it out. So happy to discuss afterwards.
I mean, I would just close by saying thank you to Sustainable Fitch, because I think this is a product and an understanding which is really required. There are a lot of users. We've talked to financiers, we've talked to insurance companies, who want an assessment tool. So I think there is a gap. And I think to the gentleman's question, it's absolutely critical that there's transparency. So there needs to be transparency of data source, transparency of methodology, because you used the word trust, Craig. You know, this is something where we need to get on with it, but people need to have confidence that we are getting on with it so that they can support those companies who are in transition. So I think the time is right for this product.
Excellent. And bang on time. So organisers must be happy. Well, can you just give me, join me in giving a warm
Thank you all. Thank you.